Hi, everybody. Really glad that you can all join us this evening for our Psychological Sciences MSc Conversion webinar. I'm really delighted to be joined by two of Brunel University London's faculty. We have joining us today Dr. Servit Cheetah and Dr. Andrei Samaitat, who both work within the psychology department at Brunel University. So hi guys, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello. Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Servit Cheetah. I am the program lead for the Psychological Sciences MSc online. So basically, I designed the program with a group of my colleagues. I also run one of the modules that we're going to talk about today, which is historical and conceptual issues in psychology. And I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Samaitat.
Hi, my name is Andrei Samaitat, and I am running one of the modules as well, the module on cognitive psychology, and I'll tell a bit about this module later on. So, I think back to you.
Okay.
Great to have both of you here. I'd like to just also say thank you to everyone who's joined the webinar today. We're going to go through quite a few different aspects of the Psychology Sciences MSc program. We're going to discuss a few of the different the modules that you'll be studying if you join this program, and also we'll be talking a little bit about the availability of this program to be studied completely online. From anywhere in the world. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to put to Andrei or Servit, you'll see on the webinar dashboard that there's a question section. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question at any point during the webinar. So while we're listening to the different information that Servit and Andrei have, if you have any questions, just feel free to question into the question panel, and then towards the end of the webinar, we'll be going through some of those questions and trying to answer as many of them as possible. So first of all, let's kick off then, guys, with if we can just talk about one of the most interesting modules in the program, which is the historical and conceptual issues in psychology, and why this is an important module for students to study.
Okay, Matt, if it's okay with you, I'll just give a slight background to the conversion degree. So
sure.
For those of you who are interested, basically it's equivalent to a psychology BSc, but the term conversion means it's for people who have done a first degree, but it's not a psychology degree, so it can be absolutely any other subject. The British Psychological Society allows anybody to convert a first degree, whether it's in a science subject or a totally different subject, to their psychology degree, and basically it's at an MSc level. Our degree is accredited by the BPS, and they really determine what we teach on the degree, because they decide what the core areas of psychology are that we need to cover to give students a very good background in the cores or sub-disciplines within psychology. So one of the modules that we cover is called Historical and Conceptual Issues in Psychology, and it really tells you the history of psychology as a discipline. It starts with the early Greeks, because they were the first people to start talking about what the human mind is, and it really comes to current views in psychology, current research in psychology, as well as the history of psychology. The module always also covers some of the really big, what we call the big questions or the conceptual issues in psychology. And kind of the two biggest conceptual issues in psychology are, one, psychologists, general public, people talk about the mind, and one of the big issues is, well, what is the mind? Is the mind basically the workings of the human brain, or is the mind a separate entity and a separate process? And some of our psychological processes do they have a physiological basis or not? So that's one of the big questions. Another really big question that psychology is interested in, but everybody's interested in, is what determines human behavior. So is it the way we're brought up, or is it our genes? And that's really the nature nurture debate. Particularly we talk about it when we talk about children. What makes children who they are? Is it the genes, or is it the way we bring them up? Think about differences between boys and girls. Are they genetic? Are they environmental, or are they an interaction between the two variables? So that's hopefully a brief introduction to the module. Why is it important to the degree? As I said previously, the British Psychological Society, our accreditation body, determines which areas of psychology we need to cover on the degree. And there's essentially 8 core areas. So one is historical and conceptual issues, research methods, both quantitative and qualitative, cognitive psychology, which Dr. Samitat's an expert in, biological psychology, individual differences, which is really about what makes people unique, versus social psychology, which is really about how people behave in groups. And the final core domain is developmental psychology. So really, how do we develop in our lives from being born to going through all the different stages of life, through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, can go further into marriage, old age, ultimately the end of life. So hopefully that's a description of what we cover on the degree.
It's a really good description, yeah, and yeah, thanks for clarifying the specifics of what a psychology conversion degree is as well, because that's quite an important point to make, because this course is, of course, it's available to people who are coming from an academic background that is not psychology based. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, the degrees for people who haven't done psychology before. Sometimes people do it because they need the BPS accreditation for their careers. Some people have always had an interest in psychology and for whatever reason never did it as their first degree. Other people do it, it might enhance career options, career development. Psychology is applied in many areas of the workforce. You think about organizational psychology, clinical psychology, sports psychology, educational. So some people do it to train further in psychology, other people interest, and other people to expand almost their current work portfolio.
Yeah. And could you just also tell us, Sevi, a little bit about the importance of British Psychological Society accreditation and why that's so important for a degree like this?
It's a very, very important, because basically it means that if you have a BPS recognised degree, it's recognised by employers, not just in the UK, but worldwide, that your degree's accredited. So when you apply for different posts, I think it makes a really big difference. I think it's also important for students themselves, because it shows that the degree is meeting the national standards that the BPS requires of a degree. So it shows that we've met, as a university, we're meeting national standards. I think it's recognised by employers. And if you want to go into postgraduate training, so if you want to become a clinical psychologist, educational, you need that accreditation to be able to move on to the next stage of training.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just recognised, of course, in the UK. It's an accreditation that's recognised all around the world as well. Yeah.
Yes.
So if we move on to the next question, can you tell us a little bit about the beginnings of the history of psychology and where some of the modern disciplines were established?
Okay. The reason we're talking about the historical and conceptual issues in psychology today and cognitive psychology is for students who start this MSc in September, these are the two modules that they'll start with. So the history and conceptual issues, where does the history of psychology start? It really starts with the ancient Greeks, because psychology is a discipline established from philosophy, but it wanted to establish a scientific method to understand the workings of the human mind. So really the early philosophers talked about what was the human mind. You look at the work of Socrates and Plato, they talked about how do we acquire knowledge. They believed that knowledge was innate, and they also believed that the mind, or sometimes what was referred to as the soul in those times, was very separate from the human body. Then you had philosophers like Aristotle. He's much more scientific in his views. He thought that the mind and the brain were the same thing. So when people talk about the brain, it's really about chemicals, electrical transmissions firing in your brain. And he really thought that knowledge was acquired. So we learned things from the environment around us. Knowledge wasn't something that we had innate. So there's always been an interest in what is the human mind and how does the human mind work. I think the next really big development in psychology was really the work of René Descartes, who talked about what we know as the mind-body problem, one of the biggest conceptual issues in psychology. And he thought the mind and the body were two separate identities. His views were very much influenced, I think, by kind of the theological position in society at that time. Religion was really at the forefront, and to think of the mind and body as one was very kind of anti-religion ideas at the time. So that's kind of the early thinking of the human mind. And then psychology itself, really as a discipline, was established in Germany in 1879 by William Wundt. He was also interested in the workings of the human mind. He adopted a much more scientific approach to it. Basically, they would give people tasks to do, and they would measure how long it took someone to complete a task. And that time gave you an idea of basically some of the processes within the human mind. So really, the discipline was established in Europe, in Germany. It grew massively, very, very quickly. It grew in Europe with certain schools of thought, such as Gestalt psychology, Freud's psychoanalysis, social psychology. In America, it grew hugely, particularly in the 1900s, with the rise of behaviorism, really. So the history comes up to the module we cover really, you know, up to very, very recent things. We also cover within the module ethics, which is integral to psychology as a discipline. We talk about the beginning of ethics, and we particularly talk about how the Second World War influenced the start of different ethics codes, because as you all know, a lot of experiments happened during the Second World War, and many of these were unethical. They didn't get consent from the people involved, and this really led to the start of some of the ethics codes that we know today, and certainly the ethics codes that are used within the discipline of psychology.
Following on from that, Sophie, what are some of the big conceptual debates in psychology that are taking place today?
Okay, probably most of these conceptual debates, they haven't been answered. As I mentioned earlier, one of the big conceptual debates really is, what is the human mind? And is the human mind simply the workings of the brain? Or so, for example, when we feel things like jealousy or love or other emotions, are these psychological concepts, or is this due to neurotransmitters and chemicals being released in our brains? I'm a biological psychologist, so my view very much is the mind and the brain. The mind is a reflection of chemical changes in the brain. Not everybody holds this view, and there's a whole body of literature on this. The other big debate, as I mentioned, is what determines human behaviour. So is it our genetics? or is it our the way that we're brought up? And if you look at all different approaches in psychology, most of them have a view on whether human behaviour is genetic or whether human behaviour is determined by environmental factors. If you look, for example, at behaviourism, they strongly believe that behaviour was environmentally determined and you could shape behaviour by environmental cues. Biological views, maybe probably somewhere in the middle, more that human behaviour is shaped by biology, but also there's always new research coming along in different ways to understand the human brain. So that, I would say, is the second big debate. The third big conceptual issue in psychology is really about public perceptions of psychology, and the whole idea, if you ask someone, you know, describe to me what a psychologist is, often they'll think about, you know, a patient and a therapist. And if you ask someone, well, what's a scientist? They often think about someone in a white coat doing experiments in the lab. So the big issue really is psychology a science or not? And if psychology is a scientific discipline, which a huge branch of psychology thinks this, the BPS encourages us to think this, why do the public still perceive psychology maybe as a soft science or not a science? Yeah, so I think they're the three big issues, and I think a big challenge for psychology is kind of trying to understand why often when you ask the public what they think of as a psychologist, they don't see as what they think of as a scientist.
Yeah, and Andre, what's your opinion of that concept of psychologist? Because you're a cognitive neuroscientist, so you're definitely a scientist.
Yes. So yes, for me, really, and I wanted to go on this a little bit later anyway. I think the majority of progress in psychology in the academic world is really a scientific approach. While a chemist investigates molecules and they have their experiments, how to find out how molecules work and combine in each other, psychologists use kind of the same methodological approach. So it's really hard methods and statistics and everything, but the subject of investigation is the human. So that makes it just as scientific as biology, for instance. So it's sometimes a bit more tricky to investigate because humans, as opposed to molecules and animals, do lie, for instance, or are reluctant to tell you things. So we have to sometimes a bit more tricky, but in general, we try to use really strict approaches, and this difficulty of investigating the human may resulted in the fact that psychology actually made some advances in methods, which then later on have been picked up by other sciences as well, because they didn't have these problems initially, but thought, okay, that's a good idea to do the same thing. So in my view, psychology really is a science. Of course, the application is not always scientific, like psychotherapy, for instance, but nowadays there's loads of proper scientific psychotherapy research, which has the same standards as clinical trials in medicine, for instance. So.
Absolutely. So moving on to our next topic then, how does this relate to kind of like everyday life? Because you know, if people are thinking about studying, you know, a psychology MSc, is everything that we're talking about purely kind of like a research-based and lab-based, or are there actually like results that people can apply, like you know, to their real life in the outside world?
Yeah, I think you know, everybody's interested in, you know, when people behave in certain ways, everybody has an explanation. So everybody's interested in human behavior. I think lots and lots of different aspects of psychology relate to everyday life. I think when you know as parents, people often think about, you know, I think a good example is being a parent, and whether you have a son or a daughter, and you know, when they behave, when boys play with boys' toys or girls play with, you know, dolls or whatever, you know, are these behaviours genetically determined? Are they environmentally determined? And if so, can we change some of these behaviours? I think if you look at the area of social psychology, where it's looking at how people behave in groups, how others influence our behaviour, this has really, you know, been applied in real life groups, in group situations, to look at lots of different types of behaviour, looking at why people conform, why sometimes people behave in, you know, very unexpected ways in a particular situation. The concept of peer pressure is all about really social psychology. Why do we behave in the same individual can behave very differently in different situations, and that very much could be about the environment they're in at the time, and perhaps trying to fit in with that environment. So honestly, I think virtually all aspects of psychology are applied, can be applied to real life.
Yeah. Andre, would you like to add something?
Yeah, again, I totally agree. And I will later on provide some examples for the area of cognitive psychology, which is a little bit closer to the scientific aspect and the question of, okay, how is that related to everyday life is even a little bit more pressing and not that clear cut. But even there, I can show that really, yeah, psychology branches into so many different areas and has relevance for so many areas in everyday life. And like the design of human computer interfaces, for instance, which sounds very abstract, and people may think, okay, what do psychologists have to do with it's questions about perception, attentions, where do we look, for instance, on the screen and stuff like that, which is the domain of psychologists to investigate this.
So let's move on now to talking a little bit about the cognitive psychology aspect of the program. So we just have a conversation about what cognitive psychology actually means and its relationship to other areas of psychology.
Yeah. So in my in-person lectures, I often actually start with asking the students whether they know of a good definition of psychology in the first place. So because a lot of people, it's one of these terms, people think, yeah, of course, psychology, but if you have to provide a really short, concise definition, a lot of people do struggle, actually. So, and as often, there are many definitions around, but a typical one would be that psychology is the study of mental processes and behavior. And if we look at that and then ask what is cognitive psychology in that context, the definition is the study of mental processes. So it's a huge part of psychology, actually. And what are these mental processes? And these are a lot of everyday things we take for granted often, really. It's like perception. How are we able to perceive a visual scene that we see, oh, that's a car and not a chair, for instance. It's our attention. Why do we look there and not there? Stuff like that. It's learning, memory, stuff like short-term memory, long-term memory, working memory, the ability of language, even the emotions are considered to be products of the mind, so our mental processes. So these things are covered by cognitive psychology. So it is really the basics of our everyday living, really. And because of this central position of cognitive psychology, there's really a lot of exchange and interaction with most, if not all, other fields of psychology. So think about developmental psychology. A big question One of the early developmental psychologists is Piaget, and he was interested, at what stage do children learn? When do they understand, have a concept of persistency, that if you cover an object, it's still there, but it's just covered. And these things, so they are traditional things of cognitive psychology, where you have to know the development of the mental processes which go on in the normal adult brain as well. Same for social psychology, clinical psychology. If some person shows certain memory performance, is that normal, or do they have a clinical deficit in their short-term memory and things like that?
Well, we've got a pretty good loot already. Not overpowered.
Okay. Can I just quickly, because showed here that there might be network problems, was I fine to understand, or?
Sorry, Andre, could you say that one more time?
Yeah, I had this message pop up here that there might have been network problems. Did you understand what I say, or was it all lost, basically?
Yeah, no, I could hear you. I can hear. I think there might be a small network problem. Sometimes I can hear different voices on the connection. I'm not sure where they're coming from.
I got very freaked out when I saw one.
Not from me. I sent my family away. So
yeah, I can hear you okay. But if anyone who's attending has any problems with the audio, please write me a message in the question panel on the webinar dashboard, and I'll try to fix those problems if you have them. Sergi, is there anything that you'd like to add about to Andre's points?
No, I thought Andre, explained very clearly how cognitive psychology particularly links to things like clinical psychology, how often with clinical illnesses like depression, schizophrenia, often these people have a lot of cognitive problems. They might have problems with memory, have problems with attention. So I think Andre explained it beautifully how cognitive psychology links to lots and lots of different areas of psychology.
Yeah, and we had one point here that we thought it would be interesting to cover. It's actually the specific area of cognitive psychology itself. It's actually quite a young discipline. Is that true?
Yes, that's true. I mean, Soviet said that psychology technically started with the old Greek philosophers, and cognitive psychology really started in the very late 1950s, early 1960s, really. And the first textbook on cognitive psychology was published in the late 1960s. So it's just a good 60 years or something like that. It's old. And it really, when it started, this was termed the cognitive revolution around that time, because there were quite a few things which happened at the same time. One thing was World War II, because people realized that they really want to understand more about the mind. For instance, radar operators, questions about attention and vigilance, not to miss important signals, which nowadays still has a lot of importance of, like train drivers and a lot of jobs which are rather monotonic, that we understand how can we keep them engaged in the task and not to miss other things. And it also is roughly the time where the first computers came into being, and people started making this analogy between the human mind and computer and artificial intelligence, and started dreaming about this. And as Soviet mentioned before that time, behaviorism was really the great area of psychology, the great thinking domain. And behaviorism is basically, okay, we have the output side, the outside, the stimulus, and then we have the organism responding to this. And everything in the middle, we don't care about. They said it's a black box. We can't investigate that. We're not interested in that. And cognitive psychology is basically exactly filling that black box, exactly what happens between when we see, hear something and when we respond to that. So what processes in the mind make us respond in a certain way. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting, actually.
So if we move on to the next point, what kind of methods do cognitive psychologists use? What kind of data do they try to gather, and how do they use that data to try to advance the field?
Yeah, so a lot of data comes from experiments, and of course it's a huge field, so there are loads of different approaches to that. But the basic idea of an experiment is that participants, do these experiments, and the experimenter manipulates something, a certain variable, to compare and see whether this has a certain effect on the behavior. And then we try to measure these effects with everything else keeping constant. And cognitive psychologists are oftentimes nowadays using just computers. So participants sit in front of the computer, see stuff, hear stuff, and press buttons, and we measure how quickly do they press a button and make a decision, for instance. Or in memory research, we give them word lists to learn, and then we ask them to recall these word lists, and then we can see certain things. So for instance, if you give a person something to learn, let's say 15 words, and they have to rehearse them for half a minute, and then they could write them down, you see that the last words are remembered better than the other words. It's called the recency effect. Now, if you give something to do for half a second that they can't rehearse them in their mind, this recency effect goes away. So they're not remembered any better. So we try to understand how short-term memory works, for instance. And these type of experiments are the main tool of psychologists, of cognitive psychologists.
Okay. And so after experiments taking place on the lab and things like this, how can these findings be applied to real life?
Yeah, and I mean, this literally happens all the time, and probably one thing where research from psychology was really informing policy making is using mobile phones while driving your car. This is research into divided attention, into multitasking, where psychology and cognitive psychology research has shown that people really can't do two things at the same time. And this then has found its way into law. But there are loads of other things. I mentioned already the design of human-computer interfaces. Another really big field which took off in the 1970s is the research into eyewitness testimony. So if you have eyewitnesses, it has been shown that the way we ask witnesses can already influence the answer they are giving to that answer. So, if somebody has seen a traffic accident and you ask them, how fast was the car when it hit the other car, versus how fast was the car when it smashed into the other car, people report higher judgments of speed. And things like that show that we really, this understanding of how the human mind works, affects everyday life and a lot of things. And there's stuff like language. How do we design leaflets for the elderly so that they can understand that, when already their capacity of working memory to understand longer text is going, and things like that. So I think there's a lot of overlap here.
Yeah. And just noticing we're getting quite a lot of questions coming in from some of the attendees. So that's really nice. We'll be moving on to some of those questions in a moment. But Servet and Andre, can you maybe tell us a little bit about, for anybody who's attending the webinar tonight, who's thinking about joining this program, could you just tell us some of the favorite aspects that you have about the program in general, some of your favorite areas to teach, and some of the things that current students on the program find particularly interesting?
Thank you, Andre.
So good.
The interesting thing about psychology is that students come with a whole, we get a huge number of students and they really have different interests. We get students who are really interested in clinical psychology. We get students really interested in cognitive. I think there's a space for everyone. We always encourage students kind of to get an understanding of the broad areas of psychology that we cover. So when they do their research dissertation, they can really focus on the area of psychology they're interested in. Honestly, I get students who I teach the history of psychology. I'm also a biological psychologist. Students who are really interested in clinical questions, because I do a lot of my research around depression. I know Andreas, my colleague, gets a lot of students who want to do work experience with him around around cognitive psychology. Students really enjoy lots and lots of different aspects. I couldn't pinpoint one. I think it's about an individual student finding the areas of psychology that they're really passionate about. Honestly, through my experience, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I think psychology is such a broad topic. As long as you show some interest in the human being, you will find the area which is interesting to you, unless you want to know how the heart works. Let's say you're interested in the human being in the mind, how it works, the behavior, and there's this social psychology. How do we interact with others? There's this individual differences. So we ignore everybody else, but just look at one person. Why does this one person act differently in the same situation as the other person? Then we have this cognitive neuroscience. So it's really, how does the brain work, and how does it link? So where in the brain is perception? Where in the brain is attention, and how does it work? So it's really from biological to more social, population, community aspects. It's everything in there. It's clinical.
Yeah.
So I think it would be nice to go through a couple of questions that we have now from some of the people who've joined us. I have one question here. Do you have like a particular suggested reading for somebody who would like to know before they would consider joining the program, a suggested reading on the topic of the history of psychology and on cognitive psychology? So sort of like a particular reading that you would recommend?
I'll answer that. I often get, as the program lead, I often get asked this question, and I very, very happily, I often send students a list of kind of almost popular, there's a lot of great popular science not textbooks, sort of kind of popular reads out there. So I often send students quite a few things. There's one on the internet, I think it's called 40 Famous Studies in Psychology. I think it's by Roger Hock or David Hock. You can find this as a PDF on the internet quite easily. I think it's a great read about 40 great studies in psychology. In terms of, I can show you my textbook that I love, because I've got it at home. I love this textbook, which is on the history of psychology. It is a really brilliant textbook. I recommend this on the course. It's got a really, really amazing history of psychology, and it talks about sort of the Greek history of psychology, the European history of psychology, American history, the big kind of key thinkers in psychology, but it really also focuses on women who have pioneered, have been pioneers within psychology. It really focuses on women. If you think of, early psychology, a lot of the focus is on male psychologists. It's got a really good chapter also on looking at Islamic philosophers who influence thinking on the human mind. So it's more of a textbook than a kind of gentle read. And if you do the course, you'll learn about it anyway. Yeah. Andre?
Okay, fantastic. Thanks. I have a question here from Michael, who says, if I decided to do this course like online via the distance learning option, is there still an opportunity to debate and discuss and interact with my other fellow students?
Yeah, we've designed the course in such a way, so it's been designed by the Brunel academics, that So you've got modules for all the core areas of psychology. There's discussion questions, there's forums, there's tutors. So there is space to discuss. Obviously it's different than doing kind of a face-to-face and on-campus course, because you don't have the face-to-face contact with the academic staff. But there is, we definitely like to encourage a community between the students, and I actually think that's more important with online study, because of the nature of the way we study. Certainly on the campus course, you know, we see a really good community within our students, and we hope that's being developed amongst the online students as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Question from Rosemary here. What would be required after completing this MSc in terms of further qualifications to be able to enter training as a psychotherapist or a psychological researcher, for example?
Andre, do you want to do the researcher side and I will do the therapist? There's a number of
we can do that.
Yeah, there's a number of protected titles within psychology that fall under the Health and Care Professions Council. So, for example, clinical psychology, counselling psychology. You can only use these titles if you're registered with the HCPC. Often, to become a clinical psychologist or a therapist, after doing the conversion degree, you have to do further training, certainly to become a clinical psychologist or an educational psychologist. And probably for most areas of psychology, you need to do further specialist training, or we sometimes get people who have done some of the specialist training but still need the BPS accreditation, hence that's why they come to us to do the degree. Andre, I'll pass over to you about kind of doing research in psychology.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, basically that means for most people it's a career in academia, and the typical one is you do your first degree, or in this case the conversion degree, and to then stay in research, the next step would be to do a PhD, which when you do it full-time is around 3 years. And after the PhD, you would then do maybe 1 or 2 so-called postdoc positions, which are then paid, and you would be employed on a project to do certain planned research already. And then most people would apply for lecturerships, for instance. And most lecturerships at Research Active University are a mixture of some teaching and some research. So there are not too many people who can stay their whole life, let's say, only in research. Most of them go this mixed route of teaching and research, but most people really like that because it gives a really nice balance of things, and you get a lot of interaction with students and these type of things, but also can do your own research. So obviously, personally, I really love this track of career path of academia. But yeah, there are again a couple of steps further ahead down the road to really go that. But of course, why not?
Yeah. Okay, I have a question about the study schedule itself and the pace and intensity of the course. This is a question from Ran, who at the moment works in HR and is considering doing this program because she would like to work in performance management and coaching. She's asking, so this program has 2 different options, which are the part-time option, which you can study over a 2-year period, and the full-time option, which is studied over 1 year. So could you just tell us a little bit about the kind of the number of hours that are required to study each week, for example, compared, you know, for comparison between the part-time program and the full-time program?
Okay, so with the MSc in total is 180 credits. So 60 credits is the dissertation and 120 credits is the taught component. So every module you do is worth 15 credits. So obviously with the full-time version, you do 2 modules at a time. With the online degree, a module lasts 8 weeks. So for full-time students, they'd be doing 2 modules at a time. Part-time students only do 1 module at a time. In terms of time, a 15 credit module generally across all universities requires about 150 hours of study over the whole 8-week period. Yeah, so I would, I think if someone is doing it while they're employed, I certainly would encourage the part-time mode of study. I've had students who have started on full-time with a full-time job. I think it's very difficult. Students can do the degree, but to achieve your best and get the highest grade, it might be quite challenging. A module generally requires 150. A 15 credit module requires 150 hours over the period of the module.
Yeah. That's usually the advice that we give to anybody who's working full time. Although the online option for the degree it does come with obviously a great deal of flexibility just by the nature of it being online. The intensity of study is quite difficult for people who are working a full-time job. So anybody who's working full-time or who has for example, childcare responsibilities, etc., we would normally recommend taking the part-time program. So I think that really covers most of the questions that we have, Andre and Survi. So I'd just like to say a really big thank you for joining us for the webinar, and I think it's been really interesting and really informative and a great introduction to the program. So thank you very much for taking the time to take part.
Matt, thank you. Thank you to all the students that have listened in. We hope we've been informative. If you have any queries, you're always welcome to contact us if there's any queries at all. If there's anything we haven't made clear or you want further information, feel free to contact us.
Absolutely. I should just say as well, if you take a look at the handouts section of the webinar dashboard, you'll see that it's possible to download a PDF version of the psychology course brochure, which you can download from that handout section. And in that brochure, you can find detailed breakdowns of all the different modules that you study on the program. There's a nice message from Surji in there as well, I believe. And also within the brochure, there are contact details for the Brunel admissions team. If you want to give one of our admissions advisors a call or send us an email or ask for an appointment to discuss your potential eligibility for the course or different payment options and how you can fund your tuition fees, then just simply download the brochure from the handout section, and you can find all the information that you need in that document. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone, to our esteemed academics and to everyone who joined us tonight. And it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye.
Thanks a lot for coming, and see you. Bye-bye.